Thank you very much. As Dr. Teutsch just said, I am a farmer myself. My husband and I farm in central Kentucky, about 500 acres. We own about 150, and we have probably fenced in the last couple years, I would say, miles of fence. A lot of it under some cost share programs and things like that. And my perspective is we got to get fence up, and there's a couple things that we want in our fences, right? If we could have all of these things, it would be really nice. We could have visible fence, tall, solid, strong, inexpensive. Anyone looking for inexpensive fence right now? I know. Low maintenance and long lifespan. My goal in life right now is when we fence that I don't have to do it again. I've got a 10-month-old, and I'm hoping the next time fencing happens, he is completely in charge of it. One of the things about fencing, though, is that all of these characteristics don't fall in all fences at the same level. So we're never going to find one fence that perfectly fits all of these things, and we're going to have to make decisions based on our own operations as to which of these are our highest priorities and which ones fall lower on our priority scales, right? And one of the things I will say is that I am a big fan and I am biased towards electric fencing. I do believe in electric fencing. I believe it works. I believe all animals can be trained to electric fencing. And what you're seeing here in these pictures is on my farm, we had a tornado come through about 3 years ago now. And it took out a house. I actually got a call from the neighbor, and they said the roof is gone. And I thought they meant they'd lost, like shingles off of the roof. And we went out after the storm came through, and the whole roof was gone, rafters and all. And that's where it is. It's sitting in the middle of my field that was just below the house. And what I really appreciated about this fence is that right after that happened, essentially, I was able to get my alpaca. That's what I have in these fields. Let's not judge me on the yard animals today if we don't have to. They are my engagement ring, so you'll notice I don't have a ring on, but these are what I have instead. These alpacas, I had to move them to one side, pop a post out of the way, let that high tensile wire pop back up, make sure that my box that was charging this fence was turned on, and it was a solar box, so it was able to do that. And then I could put my animals back in, and I could deal with the neighbor in their house for the next week. I didn't have to go in and do anything in the immediate. That fence was functional. And for that reason, I am a strong believer in this type of fencing. That does not mean that it is the right fencing for you or your operation. I'm not trying to tell you that this is how you have to fence. But you're going to find a style of fencing that works for you on your operation, and hopefully today you see some options that I think are really viable for you. And today I want to really just sort of cover the basics of fencing as well as a cost calculator. And the information about the cost calculator is in your workbook there. It's actually a calculator that was designed at Virginia Tech, and it's a really nice calculator. I will mention that the numbers in this fencing are ones that I did a couple years ago, and I know right now fencing costs are very hard to anticipate. One of the benefits of using this calculator is that you will be able to put in your own costs. So as you start to get bids for materials like posts and wire and things like that, you're going to be able to adjust the costs in this calculator and really figure out what it costs to put up a fence on your operation. And the types I want to cover today are wood plank, woven wire, fixed knot high tensile wire, standard high tensile electrified, and a barbed wire fence, because I think those are the most common types we see here in Kentucky. And for those cost comparisons, this is just a little more information. All of the fencing materials were at that calculator, and that link is there. It's not an easy link to type up there, so, but it is available online. For the calculations, I have some assumptions I made. I'm putting in 1,000 foot of fence, straight up 1,000 foot on all of these fencing types, so you're getting a cost per 1,000 feet in my calculations here. I'm putting brace posts on both ends, and then I'm probably putting in a couple larger posts within the line to take care of some hills or differences in terrain. And then we have line posts that are driven 3 foot in the ground and are 7 foot long and 4.5 inches in diameter. And my brace and end posts are 8 foot long, and they're 6 to 7 inches in diameter. So that's how I sort of approach this. And it certainly gives you the opportunities to put in multiple types of posts into your calculator as well if you know that you're going to use a couple different things. You can even put steels into it if you'd like to. The labor on it, I basically am assuming that each brace takes 3/4 of an hour. A double brace takes a little over an hour. I know that those gentlemen in the back can put up a brace faster than that, but I'm going to guarantee that if you have not done this before, it is not going to go in 3/4 of an hour or less. It's going to take probably a little bit longer as you get more familiar with the process. I also assume in here a $15 an hour cost for your time, which I know is not enough, and I assume if you're running a tractor or a piece of equipment, I think I have $35 as the cost to run that piece of equipment, which is pretty cheap for running a tractor, but it's your own tractor, maybe. So you might push up that number if you have to rent equipment. Driving line post, 6 minutes per post. Driving brace or corner post, 8 minutes per post. I know that the driver we use today will get them in a little bit faster than that. Depending on the type of driver you're using and what's happening, you'll have to adjust that number for yourself. And 7 minutes per post to staple up the wire, and about 0.7 minutes per foot to stretch and unroll. I don't know how I came up with that number. I must have done it in some really fancy way. I just assumed a certain amount of time to roll out the wire and set it up, right? Wood plank fencing. Wood plank fencing is really desirable, especially in central Kentucky. Some of the real benefits of a wood plank fence is its appearance. You know, the neighbors like to see it. The other really nice benefit is it's extremely visible. So if you have horses or animals that are really flighty, it gives you a visible fence line to control those animals, certainly more so than something like an electric high tensile fence would. The challenges with a 4-board plank fence are, one, cost. It's going to be very expensive. Two, a lot of maintenance, painting, maintaining that fence to keep those boards as long as possible, and you still are going to replace boards very often. This is straight up a cost to put up a 4-board plank fence here. It does not have a great amount of labor on it. It's not what someone's going to charge you if they come out to do that fencing for you, and I don't think you can negotiate this price. Don't try. But essentially what happens is you have a lot of posts in the ground. You have posts every 8 feet and 16-foot boards so that they alternate where they nail onto the posts. And because of that, you have a lot of material associated with this fence. So I have $3,392 or a little over $3 a foot in material costs and just over $1 a foot in labor. One of the benefits is there's no braces on this fence, so that takes out some time and some other things. The other thing I will say is I assume that you could get these posts in the ground at the same rate that you could with other fencing, but these really have to be on 8 feet. They have to be very precise in the ground to make sure that those boards nail up the way they need to. As a result, I would say in most cases, you spend a lot more time on labor with this type of fencing than what I'm associating. And certainly if someone is charging you to put in this fence, they're going to charge you quite a bit more. None of this accounts for any maintenance costs or painting the fence. Don't expect it to be that cheap is what I'm really telling you. The second type of fence is a woven wire fence. This is what we would consider our standard woven wire fence. What a lot of people have on their perimeters with neighbors, you know, that's been in the ground for 30 years and is possibly halfway still standing and sagging. And that woven wire fence, you'll see here in the back of that picture, that's a woven wire fence, is really a very popular perimeter fence option. With woven wire fence, I've placed my posts at 12 foot on center. And I've done all of these recommendations on post spacing and things like that from NRCS guidelines because a lot of people that are looking at doing a lot of fencing are looking for NRCS cost share on some of their fencing. And so I've tried to match what the NRCS specs expect in terms of post spacing for that wire, just to make sure I give you a real representative sample. And we'll discuss a little bit more in a minute here. The woven wire material itself has a cost about $2 a foot, and it has labor cost at about $1 a foot. So you end up at about $3 a foot for this type of fencing, the way I've run my numbers with the posts and the woven wire costs that I found. This would never be something someone would charge you. They charge you at a much higher rate if they were coming out to do this. But if you were doing it yourself, this is how I would budget for my labor and other things. Also note, none of these account for any gates or other things that are going into your fence lines, right? So if you're going to put in a lot of gates and other parts in your system, you need to account for those costs as well. The second type of fencing that looks an awful lot like a woven wire is called a fixed knot high tensile fence, and it is a form of a woven wire fence as well. The fabric on this one, you'll hear a little bit more about later this morning from Clay. This material is really nice. It uses the high tensile wire, similar to what's used on the electrified high tensile fencing. That wire has better memory. It doesn't stretch as much. It tends to be pretty robust, but you end up with a little bit less thickness in the wires. And one of the benefits of that is that we can actually, even though we pay a little bit more for the fabric on that fence, the wire, we can actually stretch out our posts. Our posts can be stretched out to about 20 feet. In fact, NRCS says you can stretch them a little bit longer than that, out to 30 feet if you need to. But generally, they space out at about 20 or 25 feet, depending on how the land lies. That lack of posts, that lack of requirements of posts every 12 feet, because this fence is so resilient, it can take a longer stretch between posts, it actually drops down the cost on our materials. Our labor costs, again, are a little bit cheaper because we have less posts in the ground, so it takes a little bit less time to put that fence up. Does that make sense? And what we end up seeing here is that our cost on this fence is closer to about $2 a foot, the way I've calculated it. So about a third less than a standard woven wire fence. So a lot of people will look at just the wire costs on the two, and they'll assume that because the high tensile wire is a little bit more expensive, that they're going to pay more for the total fence. But because they can knock down the number of posts and the time to put in those posts, you actually come out a little bit cheaper on this high tensile fence, which is pretty interesting and not intuitively obvious if you've never looked at the numbers before. I wasn't expecting it to be that much less, even when I started doing these calculations. For a high tensile fence, high tensile fencing, in my opinion, is one that needs to be electrified. And you'll hear more about reasons for this, but essentially what we're doing is we're putting in a wire that's fairly flexible that an animal can walk through, regardless of how many wires we put up, if we don't get it electrified properly. So this fencing is designed to convince the animals that they don't want to go through it because they don't like to be shocked. And I will tell you that when my fence is hot, I do not go through it. I am very confident that that is not where I want to be going. The real benefits on a high tensile fence is that we have a lot less material in this fence. Our high tensile wires are pretty inexpensive per foot. Our labor is also pretty inexpensive. And I don't want you to think that this is what your fence is going to cost. I'm going to give you a little bit of a caveat here. NRCS guidelines say we can put a post every 100 feet with this fencing. And then we have to put spacers every 25 or 30 feet, depending on how you read it. It says every 30 feet, but you're going to end up at 25 if you put your posts at 100 feet, because you need them spaced evenly in between there to make my head work. So I have set my posts, my wood posts, at 100 feet, and then I've put spacer posts, steel posts in between there that are a lot less expensive to make this cost come out like it does. That is just how I've approached this problem. If I was putting this on a perimeter fence, I would never run 100 feet between wood posts. I would run 20 feet between wood posts, similar to what I did on the fixed knot high tensile fence, right? Because I'd want to see posts often enough to give visibility to that fence to keep the animals in. And that's a personal preference as to where your spacing ends up on your posts. And you're going to be able to, with this calculator, do your own calculation based upon how often you think you need posts. And the way the ground lays is really going to play a role in where you're going to actually put your posts. So you can have an idea before you even get started what you're going to need. And we'll talk more, you'll hear more about that a little bit later. Because there's no posts in the ground, the labor cost on this is very inexpensive as well. Again, the more posts you put in, the higher that labor cost is going to come back up. But this one comes in at about $1,000 or $1 a foot. Realistically, I mean, you're probably going to end up closer to $2 a foot by the time you put in as many posts as you'd want on a perimeter fence. But on an interior fence, you could certainly get away with stretching out your wood posts and putting in some less expensive posts on an interior fence if you wanted to. From a structural standpoint, there's no challenges with either the fixed knot high tensile or this high tensile electrified fence. As long as your braces are built right, and we'll do braces this afternoon, your fence is structurally going to be sound. That's the most important, is getting those braces right. And last but not least is the barbed wire fence. This is the fence that everyone assumes is the least cost. But one of the things I will say is that NRCS recommends wood posts every 12 feet on a barbed wire fence. Now, I know a lot of people will alternate barbed and metal posts, steel posts. And from a structural perspective, I don't know that that's a huge problem. But since I was using the NRCS guidelines, and it depends on the state as to how they actually decide which type of posts are needed where, especially some of the newer high tensile barbed wire, you can get away with a little bit more stretch. The one thing I will say is I did a barbed fence here that's 4-strand, and I put in my material and labor costs, and what I ended up coming out with all those wood posts was the same price as I had on my high tensile fixed knot fence. So 4 strands of barb seems like it should be less expensive, but it really didn't end up being any less expensive than a fixed knot high tensile in my calculations, which is kind of interesting because people assume that that's going to be the cheapest option. And quite honestly, from a maintenance perspective, if I could get away from barbed wire at all points, I would. Although I know it's more effective because I don't need electricity to run this fence. And I will also note, you shouldn't use electricity on this type of fence. For some safety reasons, we really don't want to electrify a barbed wire fence. That is not an appropriate strategy. Things can get captured and caught on that fence, and when the electricity is running, you can really shock the ever-loving everything out of some things, including children, neighbors, your dog, things you don't necessarily want to shock like that. So there's a bunch of safety reasons for not doing it, but that is not actually something that should be electrified. Any other comments on that I want to make? One of the things I did want to note here, I have a couple more slides, but on the posts, I have different lifespans recommended here for these posts. And what I really want you to see here is that if you're getting wood posts, you want pressure-treated wood posts. There's no reason not to get pressure-treated wood posts. They have a much longer lifespan. And for the initial cost increase that you have over an untreated post, there's no reason for the lifespan that you're looking at to not do that. I'm not opposed to using some steel posts. Certainly if you're doing electricity, fiberglass, and some of the other newer materials are really nice because you don't have to worry about insulating those posts. But there are a lot of options that are out there, and it is worth considering what is most important for you and where your priorities are right now as you build this fence. From a fence planning perspective, one of the things I really encourage people to do before they get started is to really look carefully at the size of the pastures and paddocks that they're going to build. The instinct is always to make all of your pastures the same size, and in a lot of cases that makes sense, and in some cases it makes no sense. One of the things is, do you need a variety of sizes? Are all your animals together, or are they separate? Do you keep a bull? Do you want your bull to have a different lot than your cows? You probably don't need the same size acreage for your bull that you need for your cows. Or if you wean your calves and you background them, do you need a different size lot than you would for the cows? All these things should come into consideration before you start putting in your fencing. One of my strategies, especially for newer farmers, is get your perimeters right. Create one really good, large pasture with good perimeter fence, and then you can use some temporary fencing to create smaller areas as you're just sort of trialing out to figure out how you want these fields to lay out. And there are a lot of things about temporary fence that are pretty interesting that we won't necessarily get into all of it today, but what I want people to know is that there's not one size of temporary fence posts. There are a lot of different sizes for a lot of different animals. So if you're a small ruminant person, you can find a different post than what you would need for a cow, different than what you'd need if you had buffalo, right? Any of these animals can be contained with electricity, but we need to put the wire where it needs to be to actually shock the animal as it comes up on that fence. And calves and cows need different sizes, so it all plays out, and they all work, and they all have different benefits and challenges. So there's also a bunch of different materials that come up on the temporary with different levels of visibility and lifespan. One of the things that you should be considering is the portability of this fence, your ability to take it up and down. And some of these materials are, they have different conductivities. They allow the electricity to flow at different rates with different resistances. High ohms equals bad performance. So if you've got a fence that really resists that flow, you need a much bigger charger or electrifying unit to keep those fences charged, and that is important to know. And for the energizer, the thing that's going to basically create electricity on this fence, we need to figure out how much wire we're really going to be charging, and different wires have different capacities for carrying it. Keep in mind that as you start to put polywire and other temporary materials up there, I mean, realistically, it's going to carry, you should double up however length you have. If it was a steel wire, it would at least carry double that length, is what it's going to carry on the poly wires, those white and yellow plastic materials that you're often using on your interior temporary fences. Also, the number for mileage is pretty arbitrary. It doesn't really help you, but I think you cover that, don't you? Yeah. You'll hear that a little bit later. One last thing I want to note here is I've got a bunch of fence on my farm, and most of it is an earth return system. That means all of the wires on that fence are hot. And then when the animal gets shocked, it's basically because their feet are on the ground and some part of the body touches any of the wires on the fence. You see that a lot of fences in this state are not earth return systems. A lot of them are earth return systems. But I do have small ruminants, and if anyone in the room also has a small ruminant, I just want to make you aware that a wire return system may be a better option for those animals that have a lot of fiber on their bodies and they don't get shocked quite as readily. So if you have animals that are more difficult to keep in, sometimes a wire return system where one wire is hot and the other wire is truly grounded can create a shock right across the face of the animal as they push into that fence. And there is value in having a fence, or even the side of the animal hits both wires at once. But you can see here in this picture that, you know, this animal's hitting two wires, one that's hot and one that's grounded, and the shock is right across the animal, where in this one it has to travel all the way through the ground. Around here, this type of fencing is completely appropriate for cattle. There's no reason to use a grounded wire system. It makes more work to put one in correctly, but there are some people that do actually want that, so it's kind of interesting. And last but not least, we're not really going to talk a lot about grounding today, but if there's one spot that people have problems with electrified fencing, it is here. People do not have ground rods appropriately set in the ground, and they're not grounding out their system properly. And this is the most common reason that people have problems with electric fencing, is because they don't have a charge on the wire that they need. And a lot of times it's not that they didn't buy an electric fence energizer, a box that was going to work. It's because they didn't ground the system properly. And if there's not a ground, there's no way that we can create enough charge to shock an animal. We need 3 ground rods, 6 feet in the ground, 10 feet apart, basically anywhere in the state. I know that you have a creek and you have one nice steel post there right now, and that's how you're grounding your system, but it is not going to work all the time, everywhere. Please don't believe it will, it won't. And just sort of last thoughts here. You may see this today. One of my big beliefs is I said that I really love a perimeter fence and then putting some temporary fencing within that larger perimeter. Running a hot strand of wire on the top, not on the very top, but on the inside of that permanent fencing does 2 things. One, it gives you that point at which you can run any sort of temporary fence anywhere you want to, because you have electricity anywhere in that field to run that temporary fencing off of. And 2, it protects the long-term viability of your perimeter fence. You got a bull that likes to rub on the fence, this keeps them from rubbing on the fence. You got an animal that rubbing its butt on the fence, it keeps them from rubbing on the fence. You got a goat that likes to climb over the fence, it's real hard to climb over the electrified fence. So running that electric wire on the inside of your permanent fencing, I think, is an extremely good idea. And with that, we'll take any questions.
We'll see some, and if you're really interested in electric fencing, in the next year or so, we're going to have some fencing schools that focus solely on electric fencing and troubleshooting. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, what you're really looking for is enough surface area in the ground to take out any of that charge anytime that an animal hits the hot part of the fence. And generally, if the soil is really wet, you probably have enough surface area with 1 or 2 posts. But as soon as that soil gets a little bit drier and there's not as much conductivity in the soil, you need those 3 posts. You need all of that surface area, and that's why they're 10 feet apart, because you need enough soil around it to actually absorb that. 6 feet in the ground, and they don't have to be vertical, but you can't drive them towards each other. But if you have rocky soil and you have to go at an angle, it still gives you the area you need. You don't want to drive them completely flat, but you need 6 feet in the ground in 3 different spots, 10 feet apart. Even if it's 100 feet of fence, you still need the 3 ground rods. If you're, talking miles of fence, you need to put extra ground rods further out in the fence just to give you a little bit more stability over the length. But short fences in no way need less grounding. This is a great question, and I know Jeremy covers this, so I'm going to let him cover this because it is absolutely important. It is critical that you get that wire sized correctly.
So Jeremy